Welcome to On Emergence, a podcast on what it takes to be a human being. I'm Laura Sagan, your host and a fellow human being. Today, I am delighted to present you with a conversation I had with Justin Byerly, who is, amongst many other things that he does, is a herbalist and a purveyor of weather patterns. You will find out and understand a little bit more of what it means, but Justin shares his journey and his findings on how to live in sync with nature. He shares some practical tips as well. For example, how to design your own living calendar and what is a living calendar as opposed to the fixed one that we all get used to living in our day-to-day lives. He shares also practical tips on how to live in sync with nature even if you feel so far away if you live in the middle of a busy city. I hope you enjoy this conversation. And as always, if you have comments, feedbacks, feelings you'd like to share, feel free to leave them in the comment section to this episode on YouTube. And if you're watching this on YouTube, I invite you to subscribe to this channel. It's a no-cost way to support the podcast. If you want to reach out with any messages, feelings, and thoughts, you can also do this on Instagram. My handle is OnEmergence. And finally, if you want to find out a little bit more of a backstory to this episode, I share those in an extensive form on the website, onemergence.com. Enjoy this conversation. Welcome, everyone, to this episode of On Emergence podcast. I'm Laura Sagan, your host and your fellow human being. Today, I am in Peru, in Cauca province, with my guest, Justin, who is a business strategist, but more interestingly, he is a herbalist, a philosopher, and I would say a purveyor of weather patterns. So, very intriguing, but as always, my guests are doing much better introductions than I do. So please, Justin, thank you so much for agreeing to meet me in this beautiful, lovely place here in Cauca. And over to you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Yeah, so my name is Justin Ancheta, and I've for a long time, I was in, entrepreneurship, business, and things like that. But I actually studied religion and sociology at San Diego State. And that led me to my first time, going to India to study with the Jain community there. And then I started my career in Beijing in China, working for an organic food company. And so my life has been kind of this really interesting, weird mix of all these different interests of mine that I try and find, intersections. And so about 4 years ago, I came back to the US, and that was kind of like the big reckoning moment. It was interesting because I studied religion and Eastern philosophy in college, and that was really the beginning of my journey into, any form of, I don't even want to call it higher consciousness, I would just say different consciousness, other forms of consciousness. But it was really when I came back from running a startup in India that life was kind of giving me that big slap of what are you really doing? What's going on? And that led me to, because I'd always been in the food and agriculture business side of things. And so I was really curious of okay, what's going on with regenerative agriculture? Because that movement was really starting. I came from several industries that are very interesting. I worked in the almond industry, which is an industry that gets a lot of flack, and it's been the target of a lot of water issues and things like that. And so I was just really curious of what's going on with regenerative agriculture, which led me to go live and work on a ranch in Idaho. But then I fell ass backwards into actually apprenticing at a medicinal herb farm in upstate New York for a year. And that was way more than I ever bargained for, because it's this farm, but it was also an apothecary and small business. So we're planting the plants, growing them through the season, harvesting the different plants as they come in, and then processing them, drying them, making medicine, and then helping people with the medicine when they need it after that. But more importantly, I met some of the most amazing teachers that I could have ever imagined meeting. And herbalism really opened up into what I now see as the most, I would say it's the most encompassing spiritual path that I have found, because it has everything as a part of it. You know, most traditions, we kind of culturally dilute things now. And so, but if you look, Buddhism, you know, whether it's Indian Buddhism or Tibetan, in Nepal, or a lot of Hindu traditions, there's a tremendous amount of plants involved. You'll see lots of plants in the imagery. And so I was just massively curious about this whole thing, but it led me to a much deeper embodiment journey than I had ever been on before, because you're working with these plants and you're ingesting them every day and you're seeing how your body responds. But what is most interesting about herbalism and these things to me is actually connecting with just all other beings. And that's what kind of led me to, you know, I would have a teacher who would talk about different times in the year, right? Like there's like a bush in upstate New York that the tribes that lived in that area, the translation of the name means like, it's called a shad bush, but essentially what it means is that when that bush is flowering, if you go and check the river, that like the shad fish is also running at that time. So that plant is an indicator of what's happening in the rhythm. And that type of stuff is the most fun to me. It's also the most, I think, connected thing that I've found. And that's what led me to become super interested in ancient and indigenous weather forecasting. It's not only the weather forecasting part, but it's all encompassing. You know, I was actually at a herb walk with an amazing Peruvian teacher yesterday. He's like
an herbal
walk, essentially. Walk. Yeah. So okay. You walk into the mountains and you have someone who is stopping and showing you, hey, here's this plant, here's the history of it, here's some stories about it, here's how local people would have, you know, used it or do use it. Here's the type of ways it works on the body. Here's maybe how it works more on the spiritual dimension or the psycho-spiritual, emotional realms and things like that. He's a total, just awesome man. A true, like, yesterday was really beautiful because you knew you were sitting with like a profound wisdom keeper. And so, yeah, we just like hiked for 4 hours into the mountains and just talked about plants and stories and myth and all these different components. But I was asking him all of a sudden about, you know, hey, do you know anyone who goes up? There's a very particular tradition here in this area in Peru, in some of the villages where they will go up into the Andes. Obviously, we're already in the Andes, but they go up to like 15,000 feet, which I don't know what that translates to in meters, but
I think it's like
no, much more than that, I think.
Okay.
Is way up.
Feet. So 15,000. 15,000
feet. So it's like 7,000 meters or
something like that.
Yeah.
I'll do a translation.
Yeah, exactly. But it's really, really high up. And they go up there as a part of a ritual and a ceremony. But what they also do is that they're able to, at that point in time, the Pleiades star system is out of view for about 40 nights. And as the Pleiades is rising and coming back into view in the sky, they'll go out at like 2, 3 in the morning as it's getting ready to rise, and they will look at it. And based on if it's clear or if it's blurry, they're able to actually predict the coming weather for about 3 to 6 months in advance. And there's been meteorologists and anthropologists who came. I actually just spoke to one of the anthropologists who was here in like 1977. They studied this and found that they're wildly accurate at predicting. Essentially, they're predicting El Niño or not. And apparently, there is a very, very thin type of cloud that is extremely high in the atmosphere that tells you whether or not it's possibly El Niño or a different type of weather pattern. And that is what creates like the blurriness. So if they're seeing a blurry, that tells them one thing. If they're bright and clear, that tells them something else. And
El Niño, could you clarify that for the audience and for myself? Because El Niño I know it is like as a hurricane, but I think there might be something else.
Yeah. So El Niño is a much broader just weather pattern. So El Niño is a phenomena where like when the winds change across the equatorial waters across the world. So it's like, I think it's like west, it's like in between Australia and then coming over into this area, the winds of that area slow down and the water warms up. And because the water gets warmer, that creates completely different weather patterns around the world. It can mean hurricanes or something in different regions, but actually every place in the world has a different thing. So here in the valley where we are right here in Peru, El Niño typically means a good rainy season, and we've seen that. The rainy season was a little bit delayed, but once it arrived, it is a little bit heavier. El Niño for some places in India can actually mean a dramatically reduced monsoon season, and it can mean drought.
So El Niño translates differently across the world.
Across the world, right. So you'll see that with El Niño, and then you have La Niña, and then you have what they call La Nada, which is like a neutral pattern. But essentially, you'll see all across the world, some places you'll have increased flooding. You'll start to see, if you pay attention to like the news, that it'll be, okay, there's floods in Pakistan, but there's drought in India. There's some droughts in some parts of Africa. There's floods in others. So it affects every region differently, but it doesn't mean like, oh, El Niño is floods or hurricanes, or it's only drought. So it means something different for every part of the world. But what's really interesting is that there is these different ways of predicting this, but it's a really big topic. And you see right now with like artificial intelligence, there's tons of companies racing to try and predict these weather patterns earlier, because it impacts everything. It impacts human lives in terms of floods, hurricanes, things like that. You also see like right now, for example, Puerto Rico has declared an emergency, or even Peru in the north because of like dengue. And so you'll see some of these years have higher correspondence of diseases and vector-borne things like from mosquitoes in different regions. So there's all sorts of different implications for wanting to know if that's going to happen. If you're someone coming from an agrarian culture like we are here in Peru, it's super important. All of these weather forecasting techniques traditionally have been used for adaptation. So if you know that 3 months is going to be your rainy season, and normally it would be coming in 1 month, that will actually completely change your planting schedule. You may plant at a different time, or you may actually choose to plant a completely different crop. And that's something that we don't really have as much in some of the modern culture happening, right? If you're a farmer in the US, they pay attention to weather, but in general, because all of the technology and methodologies are very much just like strong-arming nature as much as they can, even though they still get their butts kicked, the fact that I know I'm going to be able to pump water out of my well and to irrigate my crops, you're not as concerned about adaptation and weather forecasting in these ways. But this is all more the practical side. I'm actually most interested because this is actually the core of what I believe. I mean, it's hard to describe, but I'm going to do my best. But essentially, if you look at the vast majority of ancient and indigenous cultures, you start to get down to these principles. I think the biggest principle that we're overlooking today is harmony. I think harmony is kind of like where the premium is and where we need to be putting our focus and energy. But really, you know, it's interesting, right? You've been around some of these spiritual communities, and everyone has their own healing journey and processes they're going through. And even like when you propose the question of like, what does it mean to be a human being? The deeper I go, the more I question, what does that even mean? Does that I even exist in a way? And if you look at it, that we live right now in a world where very much we are anthropocentric, meaning everything is very human-centric. A lot of our thinking, and a lot of this happens unconsciously. And you'll know, you can pick it up in our language and how we talk about things. It's like, oh, climate change and, you know, human beings. Oh, well, this thing's going to impact us, you know, in these ways. Or you see people who are like, oh, like, I don't want pesticides in my food. Like, no way I want to eat those toxins. how many people are going, yeah, I'm actually just as concerned or bothered by the fact that like trillions of microbes are being killed every time a pesticide is sprayed. So we're very much focused on ourselves in a very human-centric way, which is a very modern phenomenon. This is not the way that the vast majority of ancient or indigenous cultures today view reality and how they are being in this experience that we are being in. To me, when you look at, let's take the example, right? A lot of people in the healing realms and things like that, let's say you got to come back to your body. We all need to get back into our bodies, right? Mm-hmm. What does that mean? And what I would say is one is, well, what is your body? You eat food, that food becomes your body. You drink water, that is part of your body.
It becomes you.
It becomes you. I've had a teacher before who said, essentially, we're just skin wrapped around trillions of microbes. That's actually quite interesting because it's most likely true. And you start to see how, well, actually, if you change someone's like microbiota in their stomach, their personality can also change. So how much of those microorganisms are actually controlling our consciousness in a lot of ways? It gets very loose and fluid very quickly. But I mean, for me, it's more of, okay, come back into my body. What does that mean? Does that mean my senses? I think for a lot of people it is, because we seem to be in modern times mostly obsessed with the sense of the mind. Like in some traditions, like in Buddhism, thoughts are actually seen as something that you're perceiving and sensing. So my question is, well, all right, I mean, how many bird songs have you listened to recently? Have you walked outside? Are you paying attention to the bird song? That's this sense, and I'm in my body and I'm in a deeper presence because I'm paying attention to what are the birds saying? Mm-hmm. And am I feeling the wind on my skin each day when I go outside? Most of us, we go out, we're in here, we're focused on what we're doing and all these things, and we're missing this super intimate, sensual experience of the birds, the feeling of not only the wind, but what is the intensity of the sun? You know, what am I seeing? Am I seeing clouds? Am I seeing mist? Am I seeing flowers that are blooming that weren't blooming 2 weeks ago? Am I being taken over by a smell of a jasmine flower that's been blooming? All of this is a deeply sensual experience that we're largely missing out on now, that was and is a part of a lot of cultures still today. And so for me, this is really the underlying theme of a core, I don't even want to call it, like, I don't even believe in the idea of like a spiritual path or things like that. It's just being a part of this reality of earth and sky.
This connectedness to the everything, the connectedness to the universe, and the universe being here around us because earth is part of the universe, and out there looking at the stars and reading the stars and how they guide literally human experience here on the planet with the weather patterns.
Exactly. And so, yeah, I mean, that's essentially it. It's all pointing to an extraordinary intimacy. I was reading this one guy who was talking, he was a researcher in Africa, and he was working with like ethnomusicology and like sound and things like that. And he was recording different animals. And one day this elder kind of finally like jabbed him and like gave him, you know, the reality of things. And he goes, you know, for you guys, these are these birds that you're studying in your books and you have all these data points. He goes, but for me, these are the voices of the forest. And that's a very big difference. What's interesting is that right now we live under many illusions in modern culture. One of the biggest ones being in this idea that we're more connected than ever. This is one of that's promoted oftentimes, that we're more connected than ever.
Connected to each other, connected to nature. Who is we? Which culture?
Exactly. And this is the question. And so you see it mostly in modern cultures, like in the US or Europe, but that now more than ever, those ideas spread faster to other countries. And you see this when you travel the world. In India now, the young kids don't want to eat mom's home cooking because they want to go out and have fast food, right? And you can see how all the ideas are like very much like viruses, and they move around the world, and it populates consciousness, and then it replicates itself. And maybe we shouldn't use the idea of a virus, but it's use that metaphor loosely, but it's just ideas hook into consciousness and then they replicate essentially.
So you were talking about the connectedness, and I felt that actually you were on your way to disprove the fact that we actually connected.
Yes.
So I think that's the feeling I got. You didn't get there,
yes,
but I felt like it's coming.
Exactly. So in modern culture, we have this idea that we are more connected than ever. That's something that we have to like zoom in on and critically feel into and critically think into of what does that really mean? So if it means that, yes, I can send you an email from across the world in seconds, and that means connection, for sure. It's clear that we're more connected in that way. I'm not anti-internet. I love the internet, actually. I think the internet is an awesome thing in so many ways, but it's like everything else, it's a double-edged sword. But if you start to compare and really, this is something that I'm hesitant with how much you can think your way into this, but I do think that thinking plays a part. And then it's about feeling it and having an experience with these different things. But when you start to compare ancient and indigenous cultures and their levels of connectedness to all beings, even when we use the word nature, we're like, oh, we're not connected to nature. For me, that's too broad. As a linguist, as someone who's interested in language, that's far too broad. It's kind of like it just sits in our minds as like, what is it? You know, like you can't really, it's not tangible enough for me, but it's this connectedness to how many flowers do you have a relationship with? How many plants do you have a relationship with? And how many bird songs do you know? How many, and all these things. And it's not about knowing them so it can be like, oh, I know this many, let me go recite to you how many I know. It's so that when you're going around the wheel that is this earth, that there's any guarantee we have is that we'll have another winter solstice coming up, we'll have another summer solstice coming up. These are the only guarantees we get. We're going to go around again. That's the only guarantee we have. And it's that connectedness and that rhythm of, am I in rhythm with where the cosmos is right now? And so when I hear that bird song, I know, oh, wait a second, that bird only comes in the spring. That tells me about where we are energetically in the rhythm of the season. And this intimacy starts to develop. And then you notice, oh, wait, hang on, this flower also does this thing, or this plant starts to pop up now, or this other animal is active now. This is what we would call the living calendar. And this is what ancient and still today indigenous cultures live by. A calendar is not this square thing with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. It's alive, it's living, it's expression that is slightly different every year, but you can feel into these different energetic moments of the year. And in the traditions that I'm taught in is that it's all about how are you dancing through that year. All of this is to say, going back to the connectedness, when you look at indigenous traditions and the amount of connectedness they have to virtually all of the beings of the land they're on, to the land itself, to the different parts of the geography, whether that's the sacred mountains or water spots, and to the animals, to the winds, knowing which wind means what thing, but also just the connection to it. We live in an absolute black hole of connection in modern society compared to that.
Well, we watched the weather forecast. Right. That's about the extent of it. It's like, how does it impact my commute to work?
Right, exactly. And so, and this is also the rhythms of the moon, and people work with the moon, and that tells you where you are in space and time. But it's also at the fundamental base of everything is connection, and this is probably one of the biggest missing pieces, right? And in traditional cultures, that's why you also have ceremony, and you gather together and you dance and you sing and you have community together. All of this is pointing toward connection. And whereas all of our modern culture has gone in the opposite direction, and then we start to see the ramifications of that, whether it's mental health, emotional health, And the reason that I think this is such an important way of being is because you can see how in healing communities, you can see in psychology today, it's all very much me focused. It's my healing. It's a me journey. Healing has actually probably never been like that throughout history. That's also a very modern phenomenon that's impacted through a Western cultural lens that this is a me experience. Whereas a lot of times it wasn't the case. You may go see the medicine person, but oftentimes the community may gather and you may have a ceremony, and it's not only for that one person, but it's for everyone to participate. Or that person may have you go out into the land and have the land help you in different ways, and the beings of the land. And so it's never been this isolated experience. And to me, that's a very interesting thing, because even then it's not as deep of a connection when we think it's like a me experience versus, oh wait. And it's just like, it's so practical, right? When you start to walk outside, like I have like my ex-girlfriend, she was just like, I never paid attention to birdsong until we were together, because I'm always just like, oh, who's that? You know, who's singing right now? And just like these micro moments of joy. And even though like, and I'm not like an expert in any of like the birds or anything, I'm just trying to listen.
Well, it invites you to be present. If the birdsong is good, the birdsong is not recorded. It's there. It's present. It's telling you something that's happening right now in the bird's life.
Right.
So I like how it brings you, it sings you back into the present moment.
Exactly. It sings you back into that's beautifully put. And yeah, it starts to bring all these micro moments of joy when you start to see these things. I had a really good friend who was like, wow, I've never paid it, like, because in the old like Celtic calendar, it's a living calendar, and you have these winter solstice, summer solstice, vernal equinox, spring equinox, and then you have these cross quarter days in between. Essentially what this represents is just the energetic moments and transitions of the earth and the cosmos. A lot of them now are covered, right? They've been covered because the ancient European indigenous traditions were colonized, right? Initially by like Caesar, battled them and enslaved tens of millions of them, as well as then you had later, most people forget Christianity is an invading force. It's not a European tradition, right? It came from Africa, Middle East, over into Europe, and then finished colonizing the indigenous tribes of Europe, which would have been much more similar culturally to, say, a Native American tribe than any other type of culture. And so that calendar is a living calendar. And for me, it was like a jumping off point, because that's what one of my teachers would bring in. But it was always a mix of that or Indian or Chinese, with learning traditional Chinese medicine or Ayurveda. All of these things are connected in a different way. And so with this living calendar, you're watching and you can see the transitions as they're happening. And well, not you see them, but you also feel them if you tune in energetically to, okay, we're coming up to one of these transitions. All of a sudden, if you start to tune in, you'll be like, oh, wow, like the winds get really big at this time. And all of a sudden, it's like the winds bring in spring or they bring in winter. And then you'll notice, oh, I'm not hearing that bird anymore, or I'm not seeing any of these flowers anymore. Like that, we're moving through this pattern, and then the next one will come. So for example, here in the valley, for like the first 2 months of winter that I was here, I never heard one parrot in the valley. And then right at about 2.5 weeks after winter solstice, the parrots arrived in the valley, and I can hear them every day flying by, which tells me like, oh, the energy is shifting and they're coming over from the jungle. They're making their migration over here for food and weather purposes. But that also tells me that like, okay, obviously a spring energy is starting to manifest, and that's their signal to move. But it tells me where I am in space and time as well. And we don't have to go there because that's like a whole nother topic of the implications of what it means to actually know where you are in space and time. But yeah.
We can absolutely, we absolutely can go to what is the implication, because I think living in the city, you kind of get lost. You don't know where you're at because you always see majority of it in people, like you said, we're not connected to nature. Well, actually, even cities are nature, in the same way that corals are nature. It's like just human-made corals. But we kind of start measuring ourselves against the society we're in. And of course, the society and the culture is so concentrated in the cities. And I'm really curious to hear, to learn if you have anything to share in relational, well, how do you cultivate that? Being, for people who are living in the cities and more densely populated areas, and what is the advantages to know where you're at? There are definitely advantages in terms of convenience, and you can, attend different classes and whatnot in the cities, but there are a lot more that could be better.
Yeah. Oh, well, I mean, this is a really great question. There's that phase where oftentimes it's like, well, I just want to go off into the forest and like I'll be by myself and like the world will be fine, right? Yes. And then you go back into a city and realize that you're nowhere near spiritually enlightened or whatever it might be, right? And you get that big slap finally of like, oh, that's not necessarily, like, retreating into the woods is clearly not the answer. No matter how many times I felt in my own life the pull to do that, And so for me, thinking about like how does this become a part of life in a city environment is super important to me to feel and think through. So, I mean, not to start off on another philosophical point, but I think the very first thing I would say is it's not a practice, and we don't need more practices. If you'll hear this through all the healing communities and all the things, right? It's like, well, I'm doing this practice or I'm doing that practice, or you got to do the work, right? It's all these things, practices and work. We're talking about ways of beingness, ways of being. If you zoom out a little bit there, right? It's like that, again, we can see that kind of modern Western mindset where it's like, okay, I have my tool belt and like, here's this practice, and here's my work life, and here's my spiritual life, and here's this. Like, to me, there's no separation, right? All of that is an illusion. And then we tell ourselves we need these practices versus just learning how to be in the world and not being, and being is not doing nothing, right? Being is an active thing, but it's not a practice. It's more about, I would say, if anything, it's attention. Where do we place our attention? Am I placing my attention on the feeling of the wind on my skin each day? Am I placing it on, am I feeling the sun? A lot of tribes will talk about you can feel it. If you do this, you go sit outside every day for a month, some days at the exact same time, you'll feel different intensities. And that also tells them about weather or what's happening in that way. But in a city, for me, going back to harmony, like that's where the premium is, and understanding like where is developing and cultivating a deep energetic intention toward the idea of harmony, of the principle of harmony, and working through that in life in general. As a linguist as well, like I'm not a fan of the word balance, because I don't think anything is like one or two dimensional in this world. So balance is actually not a very good way of describing any phenomena. Like at a phenomenological level, balance probably doesn't exist.
Well, it's dynamic. It doesn't exist in one single, it only exists in motion. It's like...
Exactly, in motion. And it's like, I mean, if you just start doing it, right? If you put like an XY axis and you're like, okay, you have like your relationship of like husband and wife, and then father and kids, and then work, and then home, and then all these things, and all of a sudden you have, it's not this balance type of teeter-totter thing, right? And that's why I think something like the word center is much better, like finding a center and finding harmony, because harmony means inherently complexity, right? It means that there's many different phenomena interplaying in an interconnected fashion. And how are you playing with that? To me, that's like the focus is am I cultivating harmony? Because if I look at that axis again and I'm like, okay, we need balance, it's like, all right, I need to balance the husband and wife part of this, but then you leave out all these other ones that were there, you're not cultivating harmony. And so it's about finding a center, finding harmony with all the things that we're interacting with in this thing. So in a city, I think that it's starting there is like, where is my life just generally not harmonious? And where is my attention going? And where with these, I think it's challenging, right? I don't know exactly what you meant by like even cities are like natural, because that's like a whole can of worms in itself.
Yes.
So I would say like technically I agree, like there's no such thing as something that's not natural. But what I would say is that in general, cities and modern culture are essentially, the experience is an experience of patterns of disharmony, because everything has been built from a fundamental, deep underlying consciousness and intention.
It's far away from wild nature. So in my mind, I distinguish it with the wild nature, the forest, the trees. You can have parks, but they're not wild nature. They're very much manicured and tempered.
Yeah, exactly. So it's finding, and this is the interesting part too, is that at the end of the day, if you understand, I'm not going to use the word believe, but understand that this is an energetic experience. This is an energetic world. Everything underlying this is energy. So the great part about that is that you can be anywhere and experience that. For example, we're not going to be in the direct line of the solar eclipse coming next week in the US, but people who have trained their bodies and who are bringing their attention to these things will be able to feel the difference in energy as we move through that time on the whole earth, even though here in Peru, we're not going to be going directly through it. The good part is that it is about tuning into a deeper intuition and energetic experience, which can be done anywhere, in my opinion.
How would you say one might cultivate those harmonious relationships across different axes in their lives?
Yeah, I think you start small, right? You start small because we are all coming with this thing of like, it's a practice. Because the root of this culture has been cut for so long, right? Because most cultures have been cut at their root for 500 years or 1,000 years, or like, talking about ancient European culture, it's probably 1,500 to 2,000 years that was cut. And when that root was cut, that means your understanding of ceremony, ritual, herbal medicine, food, culture, all of it was cut away. And that's when you had a monotheism come in and start to reshape it. And then that had it produced its own challenges and problems with other cultures and, all the things that come down the line from that. So I would say start small. I think the moon is probably the most potent. Maybe for women, it's possible that it could even be more potent. As a woman, you have your moon every month, right? And those cycles typically naturally follow the moon cycle anyhow. So you have like this amazing potential experience to work with the moon cycle. And that could be very simple as like, as the new moon is coming, you plant an intention each moon, right? So that's what we do is you sit down in some prayer and you plant your intention into that new moon. And then throughout that moon cycle, you're just going to try and water that seed, and then you're going to harvest it around the full moon. And so the cool part is that intention can be anything, right? And so another kind of trap we're falling into these days is like the whole manifesting world and, manifest the good life or this and that. But to me, there's nothing wrong with that. Sometimes I'll do that if necessary. But the way cooler, more fun shit is like, you start asking just about the nature of this experience. Like, please show me how this plant works. Show me how this part of my psychology or this experience works. And you'll start to see that when you do ritual with that, whether that's getting into a room and just praying, for me, I mostly worked with like a singing bowl, and I would sing with it or chant and pray. And what this is doing is it's just signaling very deep to the unconscious and to the psyche. That part of us knows way more than the conscious part of us knows, and it can pick up on information that we don't consciously pick up on. Yeah, I would say just like find any way to just plant an intention. And initially planting an intention might be difficult. So maybe you ask the first moon, to, hey, show me how to really plant an intention. Please show me, and hold that intention for the entire month, right? And then see what arises. And then you listen, and you're probably listening for some whispers, but you're also listening in a way that's not the same as we're used to listening. You're looking for different signs and things that appear in daily life, and ask it, please show me the signs. Please show me what to pay attention to, and it'll come over time. And to me, that's the most fun part, is kind of what the plants will tell you, what the birds will tell you, and all the different information that can come through in these different ways. I was just interviewing an herbalist the other day who was talking about a Native American woman that he was speaking with, and it took this researcher 10 years to study all the different parts of this plant because it's had these, amazing medicinal properties. And at one point, the woman was like, no one would talk about it. And then she was telling this herbalist, of like, look, we harvest the twig part of the branch when it's pointing toward Father Sky at the summer solstice. And we harvest the fruit before it's ripe at winter solstice, and all these different things. So all of this is like their intimate knowledge that they have of this, that is completely intertwined in their culture, that it took researchers 10 years to figure out, when they could have just asked these people, because that connection is there. And so all of that type of information can come. But I think keeping it simple with the moon, it can be consciously
easier in the cities, because you can't see the stars really in the cities.
Exactly.
But with the moon you can.
That's why I choose the moon, because you'll still have an opportunity for the moon. But I would also say, just go out and start to feel your body. Feel the sun, and notice the reaction that we have in modern culture. It blows my mind to think that it's like, when it rains now in Los Angeles, or these places where there's like massive droughts and water issues are going to be a big deal over the next 50 years. And people are just like, oh God, it's raining. Oh my God, the bad weather, right? All these things. It's like, wow, we used to pray to that rain. We used to hold that as one of the most important spirits here. And now we curse it every day, right? Or we curse the sun, or we do these things. It doesn't mean that we don't protect ourselves against them when we need to, right? And function as human beings. But notice that process, right? Notice, okay, oh yeah, I'm noticing the wind. I don't like the wind. Okay, just hold that softly. But can you just start to feel the wind on your skin? Can you go out and enjoy the rain and just be appreciative that rain is coming and regenerating the earth and us and all the other beings involved, that we're all in this together, and really soak in that interconnectedness in those moments versus, oh, this is my commute that this thing is ruining, right? It's literally, we're cursing it.
Well, we're very centered on our experience, what you said at the beginning.
And it's only human-centric. Again, that's exactly it. So the other thing for cities that do have parks would be try and go, and over time, especially if you have a good park, let's say you're in New York City and you have some of these really, really big parks, those parks are going to have some things that are going to have the rhythm of the year as a part of it. So what you can do is you might look into something like the Celtic calendar, which is kind of easy to find online. But again, virtually every indigenous culture is living based off of a living calendar, which means the corn goddess is present at this time, and then we're moving into winter solstice, and then but all of it is living expression. It's based on birds migrating, foxes howling or not howling, and what that tells you. But all of the living calendar it's fundamental to human culture, especially ancient and indigenous cultures. Initially start with a template because it might be easier to understand that. For me, it really started with that. So let me be more specific. Essentially, you could take the template of a living calendar, like the Celtic calendar. So what we call Halloween is really Samhain, and Samhain is an ancient indigenous European tradition of a time in the year when certain phenomena and energies are present. That's the real thing happening at the living expression level in the cosmos. That was taken over, and put on top of that was this idea of Halloween. Then you have Imbolc. Imbolc is right around February 1st through the 5th type of thing. That's what we call Groundhog's Day now, right? So you can see that all of a sudden, all of these truer living expression calendars have been covered up by these templated, more, monotheistic, colonial type of calendars. And again, important part is that they're living. So it might say, when you look up on the internet, like the Celtic calendar, it'll say, okay, Imbolc is going to be February 1st. But remember, it's alive, it's living. So instead of being like, February 1st, I'll do my rituals or I'll do this and that, the more fun thing to do, the more connected thing to do would be, okay, about a week before February 1st and the week going until after February 1st, I'm just going to really tune in and start there. Because in the end, you want to be just tuned in every day of like what bird, what wind, what weather, what's happening in general. But start there in those gaps and you'll start to see, oh, wait a second. Like when I was in Virginia the other year, it was like, all right, February 1st is Imbolc. That's what it says here. And then you feel it, you feel it, you feel it. And then all of a sudden it was actually like, oh, it was like February 6th or 7th. You just have these massive, huge winds coming through and this big storm. And you can all of a sudden feel like, oh, here's this transition. It's happening right here. But because it's alive and because it's living, it's not this static thing on a calendar with a number. It's alive. And so you'll start to notice. And so play with those ones first. And I think the end goal, if there were such a thing, would be to use some of those templates as inspiration. That's what I really enjoy. I love seeing what one tribe in South Africa, they use, hey, if this plant is flowering at this time, then we're expecting a good year of harvest for this, or we're expecting drought. And then another tribe is using this, and in Mexico it's this, and in India it's this. I love looking at all of them because one, they're all generally looking at the same thing. Like the fundamental underlying experience is the same. The mythos, the characters that play out in the stories, there's all this little differences, but if you look at the underlying themes, it's themes of harmony, it's themes of connection. And I love to look at those to then look in wherever I'm at, because it's going to be different. The birds here are going to tell me something, like not every bird here is going to tell me something necessarily about the weather. So now I have to kind of play this game and figure out who's actually singing to me about that, who's telling me about that. There's actually there's a bird nest in one of these trees just out here that I've just seen for the first time this season. And so I was like, oh, okay, like someone's mating right around now. That's telling me something about where I am. And it's about, another point would be, it's this deep centering yourself in space and time where you are and being deeply present. But I like looking at all of them because it gives me, I get more ideas of what to look for, because in the end, I'm not looking to use some other template. I'm looking to dance with this thing myself as best as I can dance wherever I'm at. And so I'm building now kind of my own calendars. Yeah.
Interesting. Can you tell a bit more? What do your calendars look like?
Well, I mean, because I'm a horrible artist, they're pretty basic, but what's interesting is that it has actually gotten me to enjoy drawing a little bit more, to the point where like I don't even freestyle draw. I will look up an image of what I want to draw and then copy that. But before I wouldn't even do that. Like I'm like a stick figure kind of guy, then it's like not that much fun. Essentially, I just am marking things throughout my life. And this takes inspiration from, again, virtually every culture. That'll be in rock art. They'll show you calendars like the Nazca lines here in Peru. A lot of that is a calendar of what's happening in the year. There's a lot of ancient tapestries, pottery. For me, I'm just doing it very simple on blank pieces of white paper. And sometimes it's connected to the season of whatever is happening. During summer solstice here, the couple days in summer solstice, there was one day where we had this, and being in the valley here, it can be very weird with like rain and how it works, but it was completely pouring rain, but total sunshine like through this house. And this is an interesting house to be in for that as well, with all the windows in this house. And so for that summer solstice, I drew like some clouds and a storm. And instead of putting the sun above the clouds, I put the sun below the clouds, because I was able to see the sun the whole time while it was raining. So it was like the rain coming down through the sun. And that's just like the image that I hold. And that's how, and now I have that, like I'm in space and time relation with that as well. So that's one example. Or Christmas Eve, I was at a friend's house and we were all kind of sitting around a circle having a very particular conversation. And so I just like drew that conversation really quick. And so that's not, oh, this bird is mating at this time or this wind is coming, but it's just about keeping this different type of calendar of life in general in those ways. The other day, as we're coming through equinox, I've seen maybe 1 or 2 hawks the entire time I've been here in over a year. And that day I saw a hawk coming through. The night before, there was this really interesting thunderstorm where you could almost hear this like storm speaking. It was like one of the 3 a.m. ones where it woke you up, but then it wasn't even raining. It was just this loud thunder and lightning, but it's all happening during that transition time of equinox. And then we're getting ready to start coming down the roller coaster into fall and winter, right? So yeah, now it's kind of like making my own calendars and playing with that. And it's just about attention, but it's super fun to see what you can add to it. At the herb walk I was at yesterday, talking with the maestro about this, and he was like, there's a flower in Quechua, in the Quechua language, its name translates as like rainflower. So if you see this flower at this certain time, it tells you the rainy season is coming soon. So I look forward to finding that flower at some point and drawing that flower and seeing what happens during that time. Again, because it's not like separate from anything. This isn't separate from my life. This is my life. It's not a practice in my life. It's moving into a way of being. And to me, this is the way of being that I'm trying to move into. Right? And I think that's the challenge we have today, is that you have all these different kind of schools of thought, right? In the healing and spiritual communities, you have these, everyone's like, get out of your mind and into your body is what most people are preaching, right? We put so much around that and around the mind. I think for different people, some people might hear this podcast and they're going to be like, wow, I've actually already kind of been feeling a lot of these things. And the people who are really great feelers are going to be able to just take that and play with that even more and feel into it more. The people that may be more mind people, they're going to have fun in their own way. And I think each different type of person has their own way of interacting with it. I know people who are way better feelers than me, and you see this in herbalism as well, when people will taste herbs together, and some people are just like, they'll describe exactly how the plant is working even though they've never tasted it before, and you're like, oh my God, how does this person do this? And you're super jealous if you're me, because that's not my experience of the plants, right? Like they're getting this like way deeper visceral experience in their body. Not everyone gets that. But at the same time, I've had a lot of people who are great feelers, but they're not consciously aware of some of these ideas. And then I start talking to people and they're like, oh yeah, actually I was paying more attention to the last like transition time, and oh yeah, I could feel it. Or, oh, I was hearing this different bug. Or did you notice the crickets, like they turned off at this time, or the frogs the frogs start singing at this time of year. And you can see how in that case, it was actually my mind bringing kind of an inspiration to their great feeling sense and intuition. And in other cases, like for me, it's more of, can I take this ability to research, discover, and pay attention out here and take that thought and drive it into more of a feeling experience as well, right?
I think my curiosity is just around what is the advantages of being so acutely aware the weather patterns, the surrounding environment that you personally experience, that you have observed other people harvest from that. What would inspire people to go out and listen to nature and look in the nature and feel the weather around them and in them as well, because we are affected by nature.
Yeah.
This is beautiful. I think you might enjoy knowing. There's a beautiful concept in the Netherlands. Around springtime, there comes very strong winds because the country flat as a pancake. But there is really strong winds, and then the concept is called uitwaaien, which is translated as kind of being winded out. So you stand in this high winds, and you let the winds move through you and like blow anything that you want to be blown out of you.
I love it.
I think you might enjoy knowing the concept.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like if you take all of the symptoms that we're experiencing in modern culture, you look at mental health, you look at emotional health, you look at most of the ails that we're having, it's all stemming from the cut of connection from all beings on this planet and in the cosmos. If you're examining your life, the starting point would be, it's like, yeah, because I don't even think of it as like necessarily like an advantage in a way. It's like, it's just, have you begun to truly understand like what is your cosmology? What is your worldview? All of us have a worldview, unconsciously and consciously. And so understanding, what is my worldview? How am I being in this world? Right? And this is challenging because so much of that is unconscious that we're not going to know. And to me, that's why though, is that we have to cultivate it consciously. Most indigenous people, ancient people, this is not an intellectual exercise for them. It's just the way of being. And when we look at the results of their way of being, would those cultures produce pesticides, insecticides? Would they produce mining in the same way? Whatever you can think of, would they produce disconnection? Would they hyper individualize society to now where you're over here on your own and you need to make sure you have all your own credit card debt and all of your own mortgage and your own job and your own, and this, and this? Those cultures did not produce things like that. Like those cultures just didn't produce those types of results because of the deep underlying way of being that they are living. It's not some intellectual thing for them. So I feel like you take anything that we're experiencing, dear God, it's Easter Sunday.
Oh, of course. Yes. Yeah. Okay.
It's Easter
yeah.
Sunday. So
it's another cycle, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. A fertility ritual also covered in the tradition. So yeah, to me, it's not an advantage. I mean, just notice this, right? What is the main push now in terms of with all the climate change things, right? Be a green consumer. They still want you to be a consumer. Notice they don't even call us people. They don't even call us citizens. They call us consumers. And now they just want you to be a green consumer. You cannot, we cannot feasibly, can you consume your way to connection? Can you consume your way to an intimate connection with other beings? The answer is no. It's very, very simple. And it's just the same as anyone who has experienced in their life. If it's a father who was gone their entire life and now it's like, hey, let me buy all these things for you, because what are they trying to do? They're trying to buy a connection. It cannot be done, right? Now it can help in certain ways, but at the same time, in general, it's not, right? So we cannot buy our way to connection. We cannot technology our way out of this. There's no technology that is going to build you a relationship with a plant, with an animal, by simply spending time in a state of being that does not view us as being some superior species or some, we're the Homo sapiens that we're in charge here. If you look at the results we're producing, it's hilarious.
Well, I feel like there is an invitation in that to look outside yourself. So to move away from this anthropocentric worldview and seeing that you're part of something so much bigger. And it brings a sense of ease as well. It's like there is an interconnectedness in everything. And then no matter how hard you try to control, actually, that, rain's going to come and disturb your commute to work. Okay, well, I guess the only thing that you can do is surrender. You can react to it in a different way. So I think that's what I like about it, is that it takes this focus that it's all about me and me, this human me experience, the ego experience, and then actually understanding that we are part of everything.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it all comes to interconnectedness. And this is with your prayers. I was just at a dinner like a month ago, and it was so interesting because in the prayer, it was a lot of thinking like the people who grew the crops, which is fantastic. We need more appreciation for people who grew our food. At the same time, my mind immediately is like, well, what about the microbes? And what about all the flies and bees and wild bees that pollinated that? And what about the winds that come and bring the different rains? And what about, just all of a sudden you start to realize like, oh yeah, like you don't actually eat any one thing. You don't eat a banana or an apple or an avocado. You are always eating interconnectedness, because without interconnectedness and the cooperation of all beings, that thing would not exist. So it's like just moving consciousness that way for ourselves as an individual. It's an individual endeavor. There's no way, that I'm not interested in any government thing or corporation thing. I'm not interested in any of those things. It's an individual endeavor. It's an individual choice. And I personally don't see this as, there's not, I don't think, some great awakening coming. Most people are going to go off into cyberspace. People will live inside goggle headsets, and that is going to be a part of the quote future, if that even exists, if you believe in linear time in that way. But then for other people, it's just going to be a choice. It's a choice of, okay, do I want to live mostly in that, or do I want to participate in this realm more, or what is my relationship going to be in these things? And I think it's more of just looking at, how am I relating in the world? How am I relating to other beings? There's so many people who will hop into a yoga or a meditation class, and then they'll pull out their ant spray in their kitchen 2 days later. And so there's these incongruencies. And so starting to go through our lives and find, where are some of these incongruencies? Where are these patterns of disharmony? And realizing that, and I think that's why this is so important. That's why I'm harping on it a little bit. A lot of the modern cosmology, right, it's me, hyper individualism. And so even when you start to look at patterns of disharmony, it can be like, well, what are my patterns of disharmony versus like, well, here's all these larger patterns of disharmony that are playing out in modern culture. And are those really the paths that I want to fall into and be a part of? Or do I simply want to make my own choice? And that's where looking to these indigenous traditions is so important for us and so useful. It's because they were producing different results. And so it's simply a matter of finding your own relationship with those things and taking direction from other cultures and other people, because you view that as a better way in some way, right?
I hear an invitation there, actually, from what you're saying, is that wherever our audience is tuning into this podcast is trying to understand what was the indigenous ways of being. So whether it's someone in Europe was researching some of the indigenous, even if it means that going back, thousands of years ago, and understand what was the movement of of nature, what was the cultural experience there, how people connected with each other and with the wild nature. So I hear them because, of course, when someone living in, let's say, Denmark, and the calendar, the Inca calendar, wouldn't be as applicable to them to understand the movement and the rhythms of nature for them to feel that interconnectedness and permeability of human experience, really.
Definitely. And so yeah, that's exactly it, right? So for me, I'm not interested in one particular cosmology. I'm interested in different cosmologies, but the interesting part about indigenous and ancient cosmologies is that a lot of times the underlying themes are very simple. You see harmony as a major underlying theme, and cultivating harmony throughout all of the different species and beings and this togetherness. And so yeah, I think it's initially, and this is a powerful lineage tool for a lot of people. If you're living somewhere or you're from a culture that has been cut deeply by colonialism or even before that, this is a way in. This is a way back into a deep connection with that, in a way that's not only about like, I'm suffering because my lineage went through this. There's going to be that part of the process is going to be there, and that's natural and fine. But are we moving into, oh, wait a second, this is actually like my ancestors' cosmology, or this is the closest thing? And that's the great part about it, is they're so similar in so many ways and vastly different. But you can take inspiration. Let's say if you were from some place in Africa where you're like, there's not any good information from this area, then feel deeply and pray into, please show me the other peoples that I can take inspiration from. And then it's about, I think, moving from a research phase into, oh, I want to dance this dance.
Experiential phase.
And moving into, oh, okay, yeah, oh, wow, my ancestors in this place, these were the birds they looked at, and these were the signs they looked for. Their feathers would change on different years based on what was going to happen that year. Let me now just look at the birds in my own area and keep my own calendar, and let me dance in a way that was more similar to my ancestors. We got to be careful that we don't stay in research phase, and that it does become a living embodiment experience, and not something outside of ourselves that's out there, Yeah.
Well, I have another probably last question to you, Justin, is that how people can find out more about your work and what you do. I know you're in the process of starting podcasts, and maybe by the time this episode is released, it's actually going to be there already.
Yeah.
How can they find out more about the work that you do, the passion for herbalism that you share, and just find out more about the work that you do?
You can follow the Justin the Sapien handle on Instagram. There will be very little on there, but just follow it for now and be patient with me, because I am off making calendars and dancing the dance. So I'm not the best at some of these things, but a lot more content will go on there. And then I'll have links to the podcast as well, and different episodes and all the weird things I'm interested in and enjoying. And I would say, just feel super open and free to send me messages. People can email me if they want at justinthesapien@gmail. And yeah, I would love to hear from people who are interested in making their own calendars, or already are, or are interested in any of their own traditions and want to share those things. Anyone who needs herbal help, I have a large network of herbalists that I just kind of send people to. I'm not charging people money for this. It's just, if someone wants herbal support and they want to find a really good herbalist, then I have a pretty expansive network of herbalists. They can go through there. I'm always open to sharing all the resources I have for herbal books or teachers that I think are great, all those types of things. So just reach out, send, just communicate over the internet, and we can do a lot of cool things. So that would be the best way.
Excellent. Yeah. Thanks a lot, Justin, for sharing your time, for sharing your attention. And I want to thank our audience who tuned in today to this episode of On Emergence. Feel free to, I encourage you to subscribe to our YouTube channel and Spotify, follow us there. We're also on Instagram, On Emergence handle. And as always, I'm Laura, your host and a fellow human being. Thank you for tuning in today.